Hello, everybody. Welcome to RetinUp, where retina conversations happen. I am Scott Krzywonos.
And I'm John Kitchens. And Scott, you are definitely not in your Philadelphia studio. Where are you
That's
at right
correct.
now?
Yeah, I'm down on the Outer Banks of North Carolina. My wife and I got away for a week, but I brought my tiny little podcast pack, which is not too heavy. The RetinUp production team was able to help me figure this one out. But yes, as you can see, there's a nice little inlet behind me. I've got, I don't know, a nice view of the trees. It's nice to get away. But retina news does not stop. John, we've got two stories we're going to cover today before we speak with Alec Gaffney from Politico. The two stories are one that made it into some mainstream press, which is the PRIMA, or the PRIMA, I'm not sure how to say it, retina prosthesis. And the other one is the state of play of GLP-1s in retinal disease. There's a ton of research going on, and it's all kind of crashing into us at once. Where do you want to start?
Let's go with the one that made kind of national news. I've seen it on a variety of different news aggregator sites, the retinal chip that came out actually just after the AAO. And I wish we could have seen or heard something about this at
I
the
know.
American Academy of Ophthalmology, but it's really made a big splash, and we're getting a lot of questions from patients about this.
Yeah, so this is a New England Journal of Medicine study, and the takeaway is that 27 of 32 patients who were implanted with a photovoltaic implant chip could read after 1 year. Now, all of these patients had geographic atrophy, and they all had at least 320 vision at baseline, so these are severely visually impaired patients. The study protocols defined a clinically meaningful improvement as a zero point 0.2 logmar improvement. So if you were at 2320, it means that you're up to 2200. This essentially means that you could read or, navigate a familiar space. The device, like I said, it's an implanted chip. It's also a pair of glasses. And there's a new vocab word for me anyway, photovoltaic. This means that it generates electricity just from light. That means that there's no battery pack involved here. So it's not something like the Argus, which was a little bit more cumbersome. This is something that maybe patients are more comfortable wearing and living with. But John, when a story like this makes it into the mainstream press, you, I am sure, have patients coming into your office asking you about it, asking for it, asking questions. What do you do?
Well, I think the first thing, Scott, is to go download the article and to have access to the article, find a way to get that New England Journal of Medicine article so that you can actually read it. Unfortunately, when you read the press releases, it's going to be very filtered, and a lot of times from a PR type standpoint or whatnot. And I can tell you, as I read the news articles, it was really positive. And I think there are some really unique innovations with this and some very promising proof of concept type things. But I think getting the article, you really get a whole picture of exactly who these patients were and some of the ups and downs with the implant.
Yeah, what were some of those ups and downs?
Yeah, so I think if you start out first of all from the positive side of things, I think the really innovative thing is the ability to stimulate the chip, and the chip is actually placed surgically underneath the retina, and so basically it goes under the retina, and it's able to actually stimulate some of those inner retinal elements and actually transduce a signal back to the brain. So it shows that if you electrically stimulate those elements, and we know you can do that and generate some kind of visual perception, but the key here is they did it wirelessly. The Argus
Mhm.
2 implant, which was incredibly novel, actually had to have a wire going into the eye to stimulate the sensor, and the chip. This actually does it through infrared. So the infrared signal from the glasses, from the camera, actually is able to stimulate the implant, which can then in turn stimulates the middle and inner retina and transmit a signal back to the brain. Now the downside to it, or the negatives are, it's a surgery to get it underneath the retina. It's a pretty decently large incision to get this thing in. It does increase the size of the atrophy, which these patients were dry macular degeneration patients with atrophy, but they basically had a tripling of the size of the atrophy, and that was thought to be due to the surgical manipulation required to get the chip underneath the implant. About half the patients
Interesting.
had pretty serious complications that were manageable, but it ranged from scar tissue after the surgery, macular hole after the surgery, and then once again that enlargement of the atrophy. So I think more of a proof of concept. This is a really neat thing, but it's definitely not something that's going to be ready for prime time anytime soon, in my opinion.
John, if you're at 2320 vision, do you care if your atrophy tripled? Like you can't really function all that well anyway. Is that something that's important to patients?
Yeah, it is actually because you use that area around your atrophy, the healthier RP around your atrophy to really help you ambulate. I tell patients who have lost vision to atrophy, like, hey, you might not be able to recognize your son or daughter's face from 10 feet away. You might not be able to read a newspaper or drive, but it's this vision out here that actually is what you use to ambulate and move around. And that happens to be their area that they see best with now. So that is important, and we don't want to see any negative effects from that.
Do you think, in a broad sense, that there is a role for implantable devices like this in the future of GA care? And whether it's, GA, Stargardt, some other, you know, uh, genetic genetic disorder that requires, patients to have some sort of chip implanted or some sort of device implanted. Is there a role for this, or is this always going to be a device of last resort?
It's going to be a device of last resort, and what I really hope we're able to achieve in the future is going to be ways to intervene earlier and prevent the atrophy from getting that bad. We have a couple of drugs that are GA modifying drugs that slow down the progression of GA, but they don't stop the progression of GA. So it's still going to continue to progress in most of these patients. We just need to raise the bar on those and have better treatments that slow down the GA to a greater extent. And that's really going to be a better solution. And then gene therapies for our patients with like bad retinitis pigmentosa or advanced Stargardt's disease to try and help, prevent vision loss. And then for worst case scenario, this actually could be an option.
Let's move on to GLP-1 drugs and retinal disease. So, before we were recording a few days ago, you sent us a study by Shore and colleagues, and this looked at patients with type 2 diabetes who were exposed to GLP-1s for at least 6 months over a 3-year period, and it saw a 2x increased risk of wet AMD. And then I sent you an article with Rachitskaya as the corresponding author, and she found with her colleagues that over a 3-year period, GLP-1 use decreased the risk of non-exudative AMD, exudative AMD, and primary open-angle glaucoma. So these are two articles covering GLP-1 use and the risk of retinal disease, published within a few months, but saying somewhat different things. It's also similarly murky in the DR and DME space. So, there's one group by Tabelli finding a reduced risk of DR and DME in type 2 diabetics after exposure to GLP-1s. Barkmeyer didn't see any sort of change in the risk, and Ramsey found an increased risk of DR. All these studies are in the past 12 months. What do you do as a clinician, John, when you have all these mixed signals and all these data coming all at the same time?
I think the biggest thing, Scott, is to look at these with a scientific eye and some common sense, And so when you think about something that may increase the risk of developing macular degeneration takes years and years to develop, and so you have to ask yourself, listen, is there something that I'm going to be exposed to for just a year and a half, 2 years, or 3 years that is going to cause me over that time to develop macular degeneration? And that's a little bit of a push. Now, we do know that the risk factor for macular degeneration, one of them, is obesity. And so obesity increases your risk. Who's going to be on GLP-1s more often than not are going to be people who are overweight. So there's some confounding variables. A lot of times these are large database reviews. Sometimes they're billing reviews and whatnot. So they're a little bit on the messy side. So when you're looking at macular degeneration and the relative short exposure at this point to GLP-1s, it's a little bit hard to really conceptualize that they increase the rate of macular degeneration. Now, the diabetic retinopathy question is more interesting. Now, we know if we go back to the very early diabetes control studies, like the DCCT study and the UKPDS studies that looked at tightening glucose control and the effect on diabetic retinopathy, we saw something really interesting, is that when you start to have better control over sugars, initially your diabetic retinopathy can worsen. And then usually after the first year, that good blood sugar control results in better overall retinopathy control over the long term. So I usually tell patients, hey, listen, it's about that process of going from having high sugars to low sugars. It's like driving 100 miles an hour and then slowing your car down to 45. That actual process of slowing things down and improving your sugars is going to be a little bit hard on your eyes. But once you've done it, then you see the long-term benefits. And I think that's what we're actually might be seeing in some of these studies that suggest that we see worsening. I don't think it's actually due to the GLP-1s themselves. It's more the fact that they are providing better sugar control. And for uncontrolled diabetics, that means that they're going to be more at risk for having that early worsening.
Yeah, that Ramsey study in particular, I want to know what it looks like 2, 3, 4, or 5 years out from right now, where, he and his team found an increased risk of DR, but a lower risk of vision loss. And I'm curious if that risk goes down over time too. John, what about your clinic? What percentage of your patients, ballpark, do you think are on GLP-1s? And are they on them for diabetes, obesity, something else?
Yeah, so it's more and more every day that we see. And you know what's surprising is that a year ago, the patients that were on them were all the patients with good insurance. You know, you basically your patients with private insurance. We're starting to see more patients with Medicare, managed Medicare, and even some patients with Medicaid that are on these GLP-1s. And for some of the patients, particularly the ones that don't have problems tolerating them, and there are a fair number of patients that have trouble with the side effect profile of the GLP-1s, you can see remarkable improvements in blood sugars. I mean, I've got patients that have gone from A1Cs of 12 down to 6 or 7, and they've been able to eliminate a lot of their medicines. So you can see some really remarkable improvements from these medicines, and they are definitely a big key to helping control and reduce the rates of diabetic retinopathy.
Have your patients who are on GLP-1s come to you with questions about how it might affect the condition for which they're seeing you?
You know, not as much, not as much. It's usually a secondary sort of question, maybe something that they bring up like, hey, I read this. But for the most part, they are so just happy with how good their sugars are doing and how much they've been able to improve. And this has allowed them to break through. Whereas with other treatment paradigms, even insulin, they've really struggled to get the A1Cs that they need. And all of a sudden, these GLP-1s just seem to unlock the ability for these patients to have ultra low A1Cs when previously they've just been uncontrolled.
I'm curious what the body of literature will look like in a year and in 2 years. Talking to Alexander Ratchetskaya, she spoke about this very topic at AAO, and then she was at a meeting a week or 2 later, and she said she was updating her slides in real time because there were new articles being published that morning that she had to quickly consume and quickly summarize to include in her deck. So I think we're going to be drinking from the fire hose for a little while here, but more literature is good literature. That means that we're going to have less opacity on outcomes here. So hopefully we start learning more in the coming years. All right, that is it for this portion of the show. We're going to come back from break. We're going to speak with Alec Gaffney, who is at Politico. He's going to talk to us about the government shutdown. John, we're recording this on November 7th, and we are in the middle of a record-breaking government shutdown. What do you think this means for ophthalmologists?
Well, Scott, we're in uncharted territory, you know, and for ophthalmology and retina in particular, we have several drugs in development, a lot of phase 3 studies, gene therapy studies, tyrosine kinase studies, GA studies that are going on that are very meaningful and pivotal. And so kind of understanding what happens in the FDA at this critical juncture with almost 2 months of shutdown now, I think is going to be really important for our listeners. You know, we can speculate, but I think having someone who really knows the FDA and the FDA processes is important.
And that's why we have an expert with us today. This is Alec Gaffney. Alec is the VP of Regulatory Policy and Intelligence at Politico. Alec, welcome to RetinUp.
Scott, John, great to be here with both of you today.
Alec, tell us about your background. How is it that you ended up at Politico, and what is your current role at Agency IQ, which is a small division within Politico? Educate us and our listeners.
Yeah, I am a regulatory nerd at heart. I've been working in the regulatory field for about 15 years now, first at a regulatory nonprofit called the Regulatory Affairs Professional Society, then moved on to PricewaterhouseCoopers. I helped lead their regulatory center and led all analysis of life sciences, regulatory developments. And for the last 6 years, I have first founded and now lead a 18-person regulatory research division within Politico called Agency IQ, where we just keep track of every regulatory development we can, with my personal specialty being keeping track of what's happening in the FDA life sciences regulatory world.
Fantastic. Alec, I'll tell you, I think the big thing that we're worried about in the retina space is the impact that this government shutdown is going to have on the FDA and the process by which drugs are being assessed for clinical trials approval. Give us some insight into how this shutdown is affecting the FDA and then in particular that regulatory process.
Yeah, great question, John. And I think the answer is there's a lot of different impacts and they differ subtly. So let's start at the beginning. You've got products in clinical trials. Right now, the disruptions of that area are relatively minimal. And that's because from an FDA perspective, they are still able to review clinical trials, and those applications come in through something called an investigational new drug application. FDA is able to review that. Most of the work, though, happens on the part of the companies, of the institutional review boards. And the FDA is still able to do reviews. They're still issuing, for example, clinical holds if something goes wrong in that study. The challenge, though, starts to be with products that are getting past those pivotal trials. They've done the phase 3, maybe they have multiple phase 3, and that company's starting to go, I'm ready to file. I have a new drug application if it's a small molecule product, a biologics license application if they've got, let's say, a gene therapy or a biologic ready to go. And here you have haves and have-nots. The haves are the companies who are able to get in these applications ahead of the shutdown. For those, the FDA is still reviewing those on schedule. And it's able to do so because the FDA operates in a very kind of odd way. It's sort of like the DMV. If you go into the DMV, you're not going to be like, I'd like a license, please, for free. They're going to be like, pay us some money. Here's $80, $100. The FDA works in much the same way, only instead of $100, they're like, please give us $3.5 million, something called a PDUFA fee, a Prescription Drug User Fee Act fee. And the FDA maintains a certain amount of called carryover funding, money in the bank, much like you or I might have some money in our checking account and just to carry us over, pay our mortgage, things like that. So there are some companies for which their products are actively being reviewed. Now, the problem, though, is FDA only has about 10 weeks of carryover funding. So if the shutdown goes on for too much longer, there is a chance that those reviews are going to have to halt. Now, the have-not side is for any company who had not submitted an application ahead of the shutdown, had not paid their user fee. The FDA cannot accept those applications right now if a fee is required. So that means if you've got an application ready to go, the effect of the shutdown is that product is not going to be coming to market as quickly as it would be otherwise. Now, there's a slight interesting twist here, though, and that is the current FDA commissioner, Marty Makary, had just announced this new, we'll call it an innovation, but it builds on some existing processes called the Commissioner's National Priority Voucher Program. And the idea here is that a company, instead of going through a normal drug review process, and some of these are like it takes a while. A standard drug review at the FDA takes 10 months. If you have a priority review, standard priority review historically, that shaves 4 months off. So you've got a 6-month review. What Marty Makary, the FDA commissioner, wants to do is shift that down to just weeks. And the way you do that from a company perspective is that you as the company say, hey, I've got some like phase 3 clinical trial readout data ready to go. Can you start taking a look at this? I'm going to send you the data as I have it instead of waiting for that full application to come in. So by the time you're ready to file, the FDA is like, we're super familiar with this. We're ready to go. And a company can use that voucher, redeem it for a couple-week review. But again, if FDA is not able to pay its staff as a result of the shutdown for a few more weeks, we could be in uncharted territory, which gets challenging.
Alec, what happens after the 10 weeks are up for these ones that are going through the review and they have this money now set aside to kind of pay their bills for 10 weeks? God forbid if we continue on this track, will the FDA just stop all functions at that point?
Yeah, things get rather challenging. Ordinarily, when you get to the end of a drug review process, you have kind of two options. The FDA either says, here's a letter of approval. It's not like your product is approved for whatever you want it to be. They'll say these are the indications of approval. And for any of you as doctors, if you're looking at the label of that product, it'll say, hey, it's approved for this. here's maybe a black box warning. Here are maybe the indications for use, the contraindications, and there you go. And the company negotiates that very closely with the FDA. On the other hand, you can get a letter which is called a complete response letter, and the FDA will detail all the reasons for which your product cannot be approved at this current time. It's not like your product is trash and never bring this again to us ever again. Oftentimes it'll say there are some deficiencies here. And for some companies, that letter is really, it's a bummer to get that. It's going to say, go spend a couple $100 million on phase 3 trials because your hypothesis did not pan out here. In other cases, that CRL might be like, hey, your clinical data looks great. Your efficacy, your safety data all looks good. But your manufacturing data, like you have not shown that you're able to manufacture this in a consistent way, and we have concerns. Or maybe, in theory you can make it, but the actual facility at which it's made is not going to be great. And for ophthalmologic drugs, that's a longstanding concern because you need to meet really strict sterility requirements there. And one of the longest standing compliance challenges with sterile injectables is the sterility part and making sure that's done correctly.
It's very interesting you mentioned that, Alec, because we've had that happen with a product that we already have on the market for 2 indications, aflibercept 8 milligrams, it's Eylea HD,
Yep.
been available for 2 years now for wet macular degeneration and diabetic macular edema, but they have a problem, FDA does, with the packager for their pre-filled syringe, and it's delaying a couple of their approvals, and they've gotten a CRL, and it's been pushed back a couple of times, and this has been a real bummer, but it's not really in Regeneron's control because they use a third party.
Yeah. And I don't even think that's the only product that's affected by that facility. It's used to be owned by Catalent. I think it's owned by Novo Nordisk now. And what's interesting is another change that recently happened under FDA Commissioner McCary, which is it used to be that those complete response letters, again, the letter from the FDA detailing why a product would not be approved, was considered to be commercially confidential. That is, the FDA would not release it to the public. As of a couple of weeks ago, the FDA is now releasing those. So if you're working in this field and you're like, what do I tell my patients about this? Go find the letter. It's available now. And you can say the company was telling the truth, or maybe they were being a little loosey-goosey with the truth as it relates to what the FDA told them. And you can say, this is safe, it's effective, it's on its way. And that might also inform what you tell those patients, because some of those companies may have a clinical trial that's still open and available, maybe as part of a company's ongoing confirmatory study that they want to have in place to meet future FDA obligations. Or maybe a company is making that available through what's known as an expanded access program or a compassionate use program. So it's not always like either you have it or you don't. Sometimes there are sneaky back doors that you can open up to get access to a product. Or if a product has already been approved for other indications, and this is just a new indication, you might be able to say, hey, we can actually play around with the dose here. It's clear that this is going to be effective and safe for this patient. So as a doctor, I don't need to worry about what are the effects of this going to be necessarily. And that may allow you to have a greater range of confidence in the off-label use of that product.
And it sounds like Marty McCary has really come in with a lot of, I think, good ideas from what I'm hearing from you about how to change the FDA, expedite the process. Having this shutdown happen right at the beginning of his tenure, how difficult is that combination of a shutdown and a change in leadership all occurring at the same time?
Yeah, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It's been a little challenging at the FDA. A lot of what I cover is kind of the ins and outs and the inner workings of the FDA. What you also need to take into broader context here is the fact that there have been massive reductions in the size of the government workforce. The FDA was among the first agencies as part of HHS, Health and Human Services, to undergo what's called a reduction in force. They've lost about 3,500 to 4,000 staff since the start of this year. In other cases, they let go probationary staff. And probationary sounds like a pejorative term, like, oh, they were on probation. It just meant that they were new to the agency. Anytime you join government service, you're subject to a probationary period during which it is easy or easier to terminate you for cause, without cause. And as a result, there have also been a lot of FDA staff who have retired early. So the upshot of all this is there's been a lot of changeover, not only in the upper echelons of the FDA, but also in the lower echelons as well, as you're dealing with folks who are saying, I don't really want to continue on with government service in this way. Let me try my shot out in the private sector, work for industry, go into private practice. So one of the risks that I think folks in your field need to be aware of is many FDA divisions, you think about like the FDA approved, it's really more realistic to say like Steve in the division of specialty medicine was in charge of reviewing this. And if you lose too many people in one division, you start to see slowdowns, or you start to have people who are reviewing ophthalmology products who just should not be reviewing those products, or in maybe not should not be reviewing them. They just don't have the experience and the history looking at those products, understanding the primary endpoints, the secondary endpoints, the pathology of the disease, that the needs of the patients who are in these areas. And that's especially true when you're moving out of traditional disease modalities and into things like gene therapy, where you have the potential to really help people out, not just in a one-time basis, but like permanently. And if you don't have people with enough experience there, you're really rolling the dice as to what sort of experience you, as, say, a pharmaceutical company or biopharmaceutical company, might experience.
Yeah, John, this is something that we heard from William Boyd, who's the deputy director of the ophthalmology division at the Retina World Congress, right? He said that there were 8 ophthalmologists on staff and 2 of them had just retired, and that reduction in force meant that they probably weren't going to be replaced anytime soon. Alec, is there a chance that the reduction in force is eventually reversed, or we start picking back up on the hiring end to backfill some of these roles, or is that something that's just unlikely in this administration?
I'm never going to say never. I think one of the things that Marty Makary has actually done a little bit under the radar, but in an important way, has been to try and bring back certain FDA staff. One really good example here is earlier in the year, there were a lot of people within the FDA's, it's called the Office of Inspection and Investigations. Fancy way of saying these are the people who actually show up at a drug manufacturing facility and go, knock, knock, I'm here from the government. Let me look around for a while. They had laid off a lot of their support staff there. And you might be like, well, what do they need support staff for? Well, for international travel, you need a person who's like, hey, got your passport ready, got your visa ready. You are ready to get in that facility, because without that person, you're not going to be able to have as many inspections. And so Marty Makary did bring back many of those professionals. From what I've heard, though, the FDA is in all but an official hiring freeze right now. It's just very difficult for them to hire staff. If you go on to like usajobs.gov, that's the government's hiring portal right now, and look for like, hey, what FDA jobs are available, you will see absolutely none. Now, part of that is also because we're in a shutdown, but even before the shutdown, you would have also seen that. So what I'll be watching, though, is the extent to which, you have an initial workforce that is straining a little bit. If you start to see deep cracks, I think there's going to be calls from members of Congress, perhaps industry, doctors groups, to say, hey, we need people hired into these divisions, regardless of what you think about the need for government cuts. If you are losing certain essential services, or government is not fulfilling its essential functions as part of the FDA, you need to address that. And the way in which you address it may have a variety of different solutions, but that's going to be the break point, I think. And it wouldn't surprise me if we start to see that conversation more probably early to middle next year, which is when I expect to start seeing some of those fault lines emerge.
Now, when it comes specifically to the shutdown, do you get a sense that industry on the pharma or device side is starting to, I don't want to say panic, but become concerned? And if so, are they doing anything? Do they have any leverage, either challenging the administration or Congress, or is that something that they just lack the leverage to do?
Yeah, well, let me address the first part, which is, are they worried? Yes, they are very, very worried. As I was talking about earlier, that carryover funding having kind of a finite balance. I've talked to folks within the FDA who say, if we still have a shutdown around the time of Thanksgiving, we're probably going to be having alarm bells going off, because our funding will just, be evaporating. And when I say like a 10-week carryover balance, the exact burn rate of that money can differ. In the same way that, like, if you had 2 months worth of expenses in your checking account and all of a sudden, like, your car breaks down and you have like an additional expense added, you're not necessarily going to be able to pay that bill in the last week of the month. Same for the FDA. If you have a lot of staff furloughed, because many of their, I think about 20% of their staff right now are furloughed, that leaves some of their staff who may be their more experienced staff doing the work at a higher cost ratio. So while we say like it might be 10 weeks, it could be as few as 8 or 9. So something that they're going to need to work on. Now, with respect to what is industry doing, I think they're working quietly in the background to try and impress upon people the importance of this. And from an FDA perspective, like industry has a good point here. If you don't have a functional FDA, if you don't have people at work, you're going to have a lot of breakdowns in things that actually matter quite a lot to patients. If you have a patient, for example, with cancer who has terminal illness and they're waiting on the availability of a drug, you can't just say, wait for the government shutdown. And they're like, I don't know if I had that long. I either need to start this now or I may not be healthy enough to start this. So it's a compelling argument. That being said, this shutdown is not about the FDA. It's about healthcare. It's about, funding certain aspects of government. But if I had to guess, like, what are the things that are going to end this shutdown? It's going to be continued discussions over the SNAP program, airlines, and the extent to which people can actually travel to where they need to go. I'm traveling next week, already not looking forward to that experience.
You hope
It's
you're
going to be
traveling
about
next week.
it's going to be about health insurance premiums. And if those things don't end this shutdown, I think this is going to go on for a while.
So, Alec, you mentioned that physicians can be engaged and can make a difference in this. First of all, what should we be listening to? Who should we be hearing from when it's time for us to be engaged, or should we be engaged already? And is it just enough to call or write a senator and say, come on, open the government back up? Or is there a better mechanism by which we can professionally flex our muscle?
When it comes to the shutdown, I don't think your senators or House members are going to have any shortage of people reaching out to them to express their view that something should or should not happen. If I was going to be more effective there, I'd probably be trying to articulate what happens and when if the government is not reopened and the impact that that could be having on members of, let's say, your particular district. I would almost be focused more on what's going to happen when the shutdown ends. Because, for example, if you have the FDA right now not able to accept a whole bunch of applications, when the shutdown ends, they're going to be flooded with them, which means that some of the things that you might have been expecting to happen maybe late 2026, those might get delayed just due to workforce capacity constraints. And starting to try and get ahead of that mentally and figure out, do we need to be prepared for a potential possibility here? But in terms of other things to do, it's really just keep an eye on where these negotiations are going. And for the last couple of weeks, one of the more concerning parts about the shutdown is there haven't really been open negotiations about ways to reopen the government. That's starting to change. I think the Senate is going to be in session this weekend. It wouldn't surprise me if there is some sort of outline of a deal that's ready to go next week, though, as always, getting Democrats and Republicans to agree on a path to do something is remarkably difficult right now. It's difficult because of perceptions of trustworthiness, the role and power of Congress right now. Democrats, for example, aren't necessarily sure they can negotiate with Senate Republicans or House Republicans because if the White House simply says, yeah, they made a deal, but we're just not going to fund that, that's a concern for them, and they don't want to give up leverage if it means that leverage is just going to be thrown out the door once it's actually exercised.
Alec, if you had $100 and you were in Vegas to put on when this shutdown ends, when do you think it's going to end?
If I had to guess, we will see it end maybe a couple days before Thanksgiving. I don't think that we are going to see legislators really want to disrupt Thanksgiving travel plans. I'm starting to see the outlines of a plan. And if I had to guess, by the way, what we will see is some sort of staged implementation whereby we'll maybe reopen part of government. We'll have a vote on healthcare, and then we will start to, step by step reopen some additional things. Appropriations in Congress is just a complex subject. What you need to know, though, is typically when all of government funding happens, it's called an omnibus bill. All of the funding bills happen at once. Otherwise, if you're doing it independently, there are 12 different appropriations bills. If you want to do little bunches of them, they're called mini buses. Sounds like a 70s way of traveling with a tiny little VW. So keep an ear out for that. But the real buzzword that I think we're going to start hearing a lot more in the next couple of days is continuing resolution, maintaining current government funding levels for a little bit of time, having that being a vote to reopen the government temporarily, probably some additional votes after that, and then a concerted effort to figure out how do we actually fund the government through the rest of this fiscal year.
Alec, you have been fantastic. Once again, thank you. Alec Gaffney with Agency IQ and Politico.
Great to be here.
All right, John, what did you think of our interview with Alec Gaffney?
I was blown away, Scott. I thought he was an amazing guest. I mean, just so engaging. It's our first time talking to Alec, and I felt like, I kind of understood the FDA process, but I didn't understand the intricacies and the transition to the new FDA director, the impacts on the cuts early on. It was so much more than I thought we were going to talk about. And that's what I love about this podcast. You just kind of let it go wherever it wants to go. And Alec is a great example of that. I mean, it was wonderful.
Yeah, I was most surprised to hear him say, I'm not so worried about the government shutdown. I'm worried about what happens afterward. Right? Keep your eye on the ball over there, because there's going to be a knock-on effect with the reduction in force combined with the backlog of incoming applications. It might mean that there's a 3, 6, 12-month delay. We don't really know yet. We won't find out till we get there. That didn't occur to me. In a way, I thought, the government reopens, the lights come back on, and everything starts churning again. But no, there's a backlog here. So there is a knock-on effect from something like this that, if not for Alec explaining it, it just wouldn't have occurred to me.
Boy, and you think about the three big hits. I mean, the hit first of the layoffs early on with the change in administration, then the shutdown hit. And then, like you said, it's that turning it back on, like, that surge of applications coming in and that lag in responsiveness. This is going to be something that continues to affect us well into 2026.
Yeah, and I think that's a thing with government policy. Every once in a while, you don't know what you missed, right? We don't know how much quicker certain drugs could have been approved. We don't know how much quicker CLRs could have been issued. We don't necessarily know what could have been, because that's just not the timeline that we live in. And being able to assess that is not easy to communicate, and it's simply not easy to measure.
No, and we've got a lot of important products coming and on the horizon. And you think about the TKIs and the gene therapies and other novel treatments that we hope to have some information on maybe sometime in 2026 or 2027. And that all may be pushed back. So definitely concerning. And man, I sure hope we're not talking about ending the shutdown a week before Thanksgiving, because I've got a few travel plans that are going to be impaired, I'm afraid, with all of this.
Speaking of travel disruptions, we're going to be in Dallas next week. The whole RetinUp team will be in Dallas covering the Vision Exchange meeting from Cencora. John, what can we expect there?
Well, it's going to be really exciting, Scott. We're going to be live in person talking to Eric Bessie, VP of Bessie Medical, part of Cencora, division of Cencora that works with distribution of the drugs that we use on a regular basis. How do we get the drugs? What's a distributor do? What are some of the advantages that Bessie has? And then we'll be talking to Shane Dixon. And as Shane's near and dear to my heart, as he used to be our office manager. Before that, he worked for Regeneron and helped launch Eylea when it first came out. Before that, he was a PA in a pain management group. So Shane's kind of seen this thing from all sides, including PE, and now with the distributor.
All right. Well, that's it for this episode. We will see you next week from Dallas. Thank you for listening, everybody. If you like what you heard, subscribe to the show on your podcast platform of choice. You can also visit retinup.com to sign up for the newsletter, retinup.com. We aren't going to spam you. We're just going to let you know when there's a new episode. If you're watching on YouTube, leave a comment and subscribe. If you leave a comment, we might read it on the show. And we're going to do a mailbag episode soon. So if you want to hear John's thoughts on anything related to your career, to practice decisions, to something just in the world of ophthalmology, but not relating to patients or care or drugs or surgery, anything at all, email a voice recording to info@retinup.com.